The jungle breathed around us, hot and wet like the inside of a lung. And somewhere in that green darkness, something was tracking us with an intelligence that didn't belong to any animal I'd trained to evade. I was Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, 8 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment. And I'd operated in every godforsaken corner of the planet where America needed quiet professionals to do loud work. But the Darien Gap in Panama, 2019, during what should have been a routine interdiction mission against a Colombian cartel's cocaine pipeline, that's where I learned that some predators hunt not for territory or food, but for reasons that make your lizard brain scream warnings your conscious mind refuses to hear. We'd inserted at 0230 hours, 4 clicks west of the Colombian border, dropped from a blacked-out MH-60 that disappeared into the night before its rotors could wake the canopy. My team, call sign Talon 2, consisted of 6 operators. Me, my team leader Captain Sarah Vance, Communications Specialist Corporal James Redline Rodriguez, Medic Sergeant First Class David Wu, Breacher Private First Class Antonio Martinez, and our indigenous liaison, a Panamanian Special Forces operator named Sergeant Luis Herrera, who knew the gap like most men know their own neighborhood. The mission brief had been straightforward. Locate and observe a suspected cartel processing facility. Gather intelligence on their operations. Identify high-value targets. And get out without being compromised. What the brief hadn't mentioned was the 3 previous reconnaissance teams that had gone silent in this sector over the past 14 months. What it hadn't mentioned was the Colombian government's request for U.S. assistance after their own special operations units refused to return to this particular stretch of jungle. What it definitely hadn't mentioned was the local indigenous tribe's name for this area, El Territorio del Cazador Invisible, the territory of the invisible hunter. Captain Vance had pulled me aside during pre-mission planning at our forward operating base in Panama City. We'd worked together for 3 years, run ops in Syria, Iraq, and the Horn of Africa, and I could read the tension in her shoulders like a weather vane predicting storms. "Chen, I need you sharp on this one," she'd said, checking her M4 for the 4th time in an hour. "Something about this mission feels off. The brass is pushing hard for intel, but they're not telling us everything." She wasn't wrong. The mission folder had been thinner than usual, the satellite imagery strangely degraded, and our orders to maintain radio silence except for emergency traffic suggested someone didn't want a record of what we might find. Now 3 hours into our patrol, moving through vegetation so thick it felt like swimming through green concrete, I understood her concern. The jungle wasn't just dense. It was wrong somehow. Wu had mentioned it first, quiet enough that only Martinez and I heard. "Anyone else notice we haven't seen any animals?" He was right. No monkeys crashing through the canopy, no birds calling territory, no insects beyond the mosquitoes that seemed drawn to our thermal signatures like iron filings to a magnet. Just silence, broken only by our own movement and the constant drip of moisture from leaves overhead. Herrera, moving point with the practiced silence of someone born to this environment, had stopped twice to examine broken vegetation. The second time, he'd waved Vance forward, and I'd seen something in his expression that I'd rarely witnessed in a combat veteran. Genuine fear, the kind that comes from knowing rather than imagining. "This wasn't made by humans," he'd whispered in accented English, pointing to a massive handprint pressed into the mud beside a fallen log. The print was humanoid but wrong, too large, with claw marks extending from each digit. "We should turn back, Capitan. The old stories about this place, they're not just stories." Vance had made the call every operator dreads and respects. Mission before comfort. We proceed, eyes open, weapons tight. "Chen, you're pulling rear security. If something's following us, I want your eyes on our 6. I'd nodded, adjusting my M4 and activating the AIM PVS-15 night vision monocular mounted to my helmet. Through the green phosphor display, the jungle looked even more alien, shadows within shadows, and the constant movement of foliage in the light wind created phantom shapes that my brain kept trying to resolve into threats. That's when I'd first felt it, the sensation of being watched by something that understood exactly what we were and how to kill us. It wasn't the paranoid hyper-awareness of combat operations. This was different, more primal. Every combat veteran develops an instinct for danger, a 6th sense that screams warnings when threats materialize. Mine was screaming now, but I couldn't identify the source. I performed a deliberate 360 scan, checking our perimeter, the canopy above, the dense underbrush on all sides. Nothing, but the feeling didn't fade. Rodriguez had broken squelch twice on our internal radio net, the encrypted Motorola systems we used for team communications. Talon 2, this is Redline. Anyone else getting weird readings on thermals? I'm seeing heat signatures that appear and disappear. Pattern doesn't match any known animal behavior. Vance had responded immediately. Define weird, Redline. There'd been a pause, filled only with the sound of our movement through vegetation, before Rodriguez answered, signatures moving parallel to our route, approximately 50 meters out, multiple contacts. But they're not staying visible long enough for positive identification. Temperature differential suggests large mammals, but the movement pattern is coordinated, like they're pacing us. Martinez, our breacher and the team's heavy weapons specialist, had shifted his M249 saw to a more aggressive carry position. At 23, he was the youngest member of Talon 2, but he'd earned his tab the hard way, through combat deployments that had aged him beyond his years. Jaguars hunt alone, he'd muttered, more to himself than the team. So what the hell is coordinating out there? No one had answered, because none of us wanted to voice the possibilities forming in our minds. We'd maintained tactical spacing as we moved, each operator positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, while minimizing the chance that a single ambush could take out multiple team members. The standard operating procedure was automatic now, drilled into us through thousands of hours of training. But the execution felt different here. Every step required conscious effort to maintain noise discipline. Every pause to check our route felt like an invitation for something to close the distance. The objective, the suspected processing facility, was still 2 clicks northeast, nestled in a valley between 2 ridges that created a natural concealment from aerial observation. Our intel suggested the cartel was using the gap's reputation and inaccessibility as security, counting on superstition and terrain to keep law enforcement and rival organizations away. It was a smart play, strategically sound, and it would have worked if the United States hadn't decided this particular cocaine pipeline was feeding too much product into American cities. But as I maintained rear security, watching our back trail through night vision that turned the world into shades of green and black, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd walked into something far more complex than a drug interdiction mission. The handprint Herrera had found was too large to be human, too deliberate to be random. And those heat signatures Rodriguez was tracking, coordinated movement suggested intelligence, planning, tactics. Vance called a halt at 0547 hours, as the jungle began its transition from night to pre-dawn. We'd covered barely a click and a half in 3 hours, painfully slow progress even for this terrain, and the delay was eating into our timeline. The plan called for us to reach the observation point overlooking the facility by 0800 hours, conduct surveillance throughout the day, and extract at nightfall. But plans, as every operator knows, rarely survive first contact with reality. We formed a security perimeter in a small clearing, each operator facing outward, weapons ready. Wu broke out his medical kit to check Martinez's ankle. The breacher had taken a bad step an hour back and was compensating with a slight limp. As the medic worked, Vance pulled out her tablet, accessing the encrypted satellite imagery we'd downloaded before insertion. The blue glow from the screen lit her face in the darkness, highlighting the concentration in her features. Redline, give me a comms check, Vance ordered quietly. Rodriguez, positioned to my left, adjusted his radio pack and cycled through frequencies. All nets green, ma'am, but I'm getting intermittent interference on the emergency frequency. Pattern doesn't match atmospheric conditions or known electronic warfare signatures. Vance's jaw tightened. Triangulate the source. Rodriguez worked his equipment for 30 seconds before responding. Source appears to be moving, multiple locations, roughly matching those thermal contacts I reported earlier. The implications settled over us like a cold rain. Whatever was pacing us wasn't just tracking. It was using some kind of technology or producing an effect that interfered with our communications. That eliminated natural predators from the equation, leaving us with possibilities that ranged from cartel counter-surveillance teams to something the mission brief had failed to mention entirely. Herrera, who'd been silent since showing us the handprint, finally spoke up. His voice carried the weight of someone sharing information they'd rather keep buried. My grandfather was Embera, from the tribes that have lived in the Gap for centuries. He told stories about the Guardians, beings that protect the deep jungle from those who would exploit it. He said they looked almost human from a distance, but up close, you could see they were something else, taller, stronger, with eyes that reflected light like animals. He said they hunted in packs, used tools, and that they never left survivors who tried to harm their territory. Martinez snorted, a sound that was half humor, half nerves. Sarge, with respect, We're here to observe cartel operations, not chase local folklore. But his grip on the saw had tightened, and I noticed he'd positioned himself to have a clear field of fire into the jungle behind us. Herrera didn't take offense. I'm not asking you to believe, Private. I'm asking you to be prepared for what belief might not matter when you're facing it. Vance made the decision with the same calm authority that had kept us alive through a dozen operations. We proceed to objective as planned, but we modify our tactical posture. Combat spacing increases to 20 meters. Full noise discipline. Weapons condition 1. Wu, Martinez, you're now rotating rear security with Chen every 30 minutes. I want fresh eyes watching our back. Herrera, you maintain point, but if you see anything at all, that suggests we're walking into an ambush, you call it immediately. Are we clear? The affirmatives came back quiet and professional, but I could hear the tension underlying each response. As we prepared to move out, Wu finished wrapping Martinez's ankle and moved to my position. The medic was 10 years older than me, a veteran of Afghanistan who'd seen enough combat to fill several lifetimes. Chen, you feel it too, don't you? He asked quietly. I didn't insult him by pretending not to understand. Yeah, something's wrong here. We're not hunters on this op, we're being hunted. Wu nodded slowly. Question is, are we prey or competition? Because I'm not sure which answer I'd prefer. 72 hours before we'd inserted into the gap, Talon 2 had assembled in a secure briefing room at Howard Air Force Base in Panama City. The room was standard military issue. Concrete walls painted institutional beige, fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical current, and a secure communications terminal that connected us to Southcom headquarters in Florida. Major Patricia Donovan, our battalion intelligence officer, had flown in specifically for this briefing, which should have been our first warning that something about this mission extended beyond routine cartel interdiction. Donovan was regular Army intelligence, not special operations, which made her presence unusual. She'd laid out the briefing materials with precise movements that spoke to a mind that organized information the way operators organized equipment. Everything in its place, nothing left to chance. Talon 2, thank you for your punctuality. What I'm about to share is classified top secret, with additional compartmentalization that limits distribution to operational personnel only. Before we begin, confirm you've all reviewed and signed your security acknowledgements. We'd confirmed, and Donovan had activated the room's secure protocols, electronic countermeasures that prevented any signals from entering or leaving, white noise generators that defeated listening devices, and a guard posted outside who'd been cleared to special access program levels. The level of security wasn't unusual for special operations missions, but the Major's nervousness was. I'd watched her hands shake slightly as she'd pulled up the first set of satellite images on the main display screen. Your primary objective is this facility, she'd begun, highlighting a cluster of structures barely visible through the jungle canopy. Intelligence suggests it's a cocaine processing operation run by the Medellin cartel's successor organization, processing approximately 300 kilograms per week for distribution throughout Central and North America. The facility has been operating for approximately 18 months and represents a significant escalation in cartel operations within Panamanian territory. Vance had leaned forward, studying the imagery. Major, this facility is deep in the Darien Gap, one of the most inaccessible regions in Central America. How'd they get the infrastructure in there? The logistics alone would be massive. Donovan had nodded, as if expecting the question. We believe they're using a combination of helicopter insertion and indigenous trail networks. What concerns us more is their security posture. Enhanced imagery suggests they've established a defensive perimeter that's unusually sophisticated for cartel operations. Motion sensors, possibly thermal cameras, and a quick reaction force estimated at 15 to 20 armed personnel. Rodriguez had pulled up the coordinates on his own tablet, cross-referencing them with topographical data. Ma'am, this puts them right in the middle of what locals call the dead zone. There are literally dozens of reports of missing persons, unexplained disappearances, and failed expeditions in this area going back decades. Even the FARC guerrillas avoided this sector during the Colombian Civil War. Donovan's expression had remained neutral, but I'd caught the brief flicker of something in her eyes, confirmation that we were touching on information she'd been instructed not to share. The State Department is aware of the local folklore, Donovan had replied carefully. Our assessment is that the cartel has deliberately chosen this location precisely because of its reputation, using superstition as an additional security measure. Your mission is to conduct close target reconnaissance, identify key personnel, assess the facility's production capacity, and provide targeting data for a potential follow-on operation by Panamanian National Police with DEA support. The State Department is aware of the local folklore, Donovan had replied carefully. Our assessment is that the cartel has deliberately chosen this location precisely because of its reputation, using superstition as an additional security measure. Your mission is to conduct close target reconnaissance, identify key personnel, assess the facility's production capacity, and provide targeting data for a potential follow-on operation by Panamanian National Police with DEA support. Martinez had voiced the question we'd all been thinking. Why not just hit them from the air? Precision strike could take out the facility without risking a ground team in terrain this hostile. Donovan had paused before answering, choosing her words with visible care. Political considerations require that any action be attributable to Panamanian authorities, not U.S. military forces. Additionally, we need human intelligence, documents, computers, personnel for interrogation, that an airstrike would destroy. Your insertion and extraction will be covert, your presence deniable, and your intelligence product will form the basis for a Panamanian-led raid. The briefing had continued for 2 hours, covering everything from expected weather patterns to escape and evasion routes if we were compromised. Donovan had provided detailed information on the cartel's known tactics, the capabilities of their security forces, and the estimated response time if they called for reinforcements from their main base camp 60 clicks to the south. But what she hadn't mentioned, what had been conspicuously absent from every slide and briefing document, was any reference to the 3 previous reconnaissance missions that had failed in this area. I discovered those missions by accident, during a routine check of operational databases while preparing my equipment. 3 separate attempts to establish surveillance on cartel activities in the Darien Gap, all within the past 14 months, all terminated with loss of contact and no recovery of personnel or remains. The missions had been classified and sealed, their after-action reports restricted to a level above my clearance, but the basic data was there if you knew where to look and had the access credentials to find it. After the official briefing concluded, I'd requested a private word with Vance. We'd stepped into a small office adjacent to the briefing room, and I'd shown her what I'd found. She'd studied the database entries in silence, her expression hardening with each line she read. "They know," she'd finally said. "Donovan, Southcom, someone up the chain knows these missions failed, and they're sending us anyway." I'd nodded. "Question is, do we refuse the mission? Or do we go in with our eyes open knowing there's something they're not telling us?" Vance had been my team leader for 3 years, and in that time, we'd developed the kind of trust that only comes from shared combat. She wasn't the type to send her people into danger without understanding the risks, but she also wasn't the type to back down from a mission just because it was dangerous. Every special operations mission carried risk. That was the fundamental nature of what we did. "We go," she'd decided. "But we go prepared for something beyond the mission brief. Extra ammunition, enhanced medical supplies, and we establish rally points and extraction alternatives that aren't in the official plan. If this goes sideways, I want options that don't require us to wait for permission." The next 48 hours had been consumed with preparation. Wu had assembled a medical kit that could handle everything from minor injuries to catastrophic trauma, including additional tourniquets, hemostatic agents, and antibiotics that went beyond standard combat medic supplies. Martinez had loaded extra ammunition for the SAW, bringing his basic load to 1,200 rounds instead of the usual 800. Rodriguez had programmed multiple emergency frequencies into our radios and packed a backup communication system that operated on entirely different protocols than our primary equipment. Herrera, our Panamanian liaison, had provided the most valuable preparation, knowledge. He'd spent hours briefing us on the Gap's unique challenges, the vegetation that could cut exposed skin like razor wire, the insects that carried diseases with names I couldn't pronounce, the weather patterns that could shift from clear to torrential downpour in minutes, and the indigenous tribes who sometimes helped outsiders and sometimes didn't, depending on factors that outsiders rarely understood. The Gap isn't just jungle, Herrera had explained over a map spread across a folding table in our team room. It's 10,000 square kilometers where normal rules don't apply. The government barely exists there, maps are unreliable, and even the GPS satellites have trouble maintaining consistent signals under the canopy. People go in and don't come out. Not just soldiers and drug runners, but scientists, explorers, missionaries. The official explanation is usually environmental factors, but the locals know better. He'd traced a circle around our objective with one finger. This area, specifically, has the worst reputation. Even the drug runners are nervous about it, which is why they pay their security forces triple the normal rate. I'd spent my preparation time doing what I always did before missions, checking and rechecking my equipment. My M4 carbine had been cleaned, lubricated, and test-fired to confirm 0. I'd loaded 9 magazines with a mix of M855A1 armor-piercing rounds and M856A1 tracers with 1 magazine of M995 AP rounds reserved for hard targets. My sidearm, a Glock 19, carried 2 spare magazines. Beyond weapons, I'd packed my kit with the essentials that kept operators alive: night vision, GPS, compass, maps, water purification, first aid, high-energy rations, and the hundreds of small items that most people never thought about until they needed them in the middle of nowhere. The night before insertion, the team had gathered in our barracks for what we called a dirt dive, a final rehearsal of the mission plan where we walked through every phase, identified potential problems, and discussed contingencies. We'd laid out all our equipment, verified radio frequencies, confirmed call signs and authentication codes, and ensured everyone understood their role during each phase of the operation. It was a ritual as old as special operations itself, the last opportunity to catch mistakes before they became fatal. "Let's talk about what happens if we're compromised," Vance had said, pulling up a satellite image on her tablet. "Primary extraction point is here, secondary here, tertiary here. If we can't reach any of those, we've got a contingency route that takes us south to the Colombian border, 20 clicks through some of the worst terrain in Central America, but it ends at a Colombian army outpost that's been briefed to expect possible American personnel in extremis." She'd paused, making eye contact with each of us in turn. "If something goes wrong, we don't wait for rescue. We make our own way out. Clear?" Wu had raised a concern that had been bothering all of us. "Captain, what about those previous missions, the ones that didn't come back?" Vance had acknowledged the elephant in the room with characteristic directness. "I don't know what happened to them, and neither does anyone who was willing to tell me. What I do know is that we're not them. We're Talon too. We've operated in worse places than this, and we're coming home with our intelligence product and all our people. But it means we watch each other's backs. We trust our instincts, and if something feels wrong, we don't ignore it. This team has stayed alive because we're smart, professional, and we don't take stupid chances. That doesn't change just because we're walking into an area with a bad reputation." Martinez had voiced what we were all thinking. "You think it's something other than the cartel we need to worry about?" Vance had considered the question before answering honestly. "I think there's information we don't have, and that makes this mission more dangerous than it should be. So we prepare for everything: hostile forces, environmental hazards, and the possibility that whatever took out those previous teams is still active in our area of operations. We don't get scared, we don't get careless, and we absolutely do not underestimate what we might be facing." Herrera had added his own warning, speaking with the authority of someone who'd grown up hearing stories about the Gap. "In my culture, we believe the jungle has guardians, protectors who keep the balance between man and nature. The old stories say they were here before humans, that they learned to hide from us, and that they only reveal themselves when someone threatens what they protect. I don't know if I believe those stories, but I know that something in that part of the Gap has killed experienced operators, frightened cartel soldiers, and made even the indigenous tribes nervous. Whatever it is, it's real enough that people with guns and training don't come back from encountering it." We'd finished our preparations as midnight approached, each of us retreating to our own thoughts and rituals. Some operators slept easily before missions. Others, like me, found sleep impossible and spent the hours in quiet preparation, mental rehearsal of the tasks ahead. I'd written a letter to my sister, as I did before every operation. Not to be mailed, just words on paper that helped me organize my thoughts and reminded me what I was fighting for. Then I'd double-checked my equipment one final time, knowing that in the Gap, under hostile conditions, and possibly facing threats the briefing hadn't prepared us for. Our gear was the thin line between mission success and catastrophic failure. At 0200 hours, we'd moved to the flight line where the MH-60 waited, its rotors already turning, the crew chief checking systems with the methodical precision that kept helicopters flying and operators alive. The pilot, a chief warrant officer named Collins, who'd flown missions everywhere from Afghanistan to Africa, had given us a thumbs up as we'd loaded our gear. Talon 2, welcome aboard. Weather's clear, flight time is 45 minutes, and I'll get you to your LZ on time and undetected. After that, you're on your own until extraction. Stay safe out there. The flight had been routine, if flying blacked out over hostile territory at 200 feet could ever be considered routine. Through the open door of the helicopter, I'd watched the lights of Panama City fade behind us, replaced by the absolute darkness of the jungle below. No roads, no villages, no signs of human presence. Just an endless carpet of vegetation that looked hostile even from the air. As we'd approached the insertion point, Collins had dropped even lower, skimming the canopy, using terrain masking to avoid detection by radar or visual observation. The insertion itself had taken less than 30 seconds, the helicopter flaring into a hover, the team fast roping down into a small clearing, then the aircraft disappearing into the night as if it had never existed. We'd formed a security perimeter immediately, weapons outward, waiting in silence for 5 minutes to confirm we hadn't been detected. When no reaction came, Vance had given the signal to move, and we'd begun the long patrol toward our objective. That had been 3 hours ago, and now, crouched in a defensive perimeter with something unknown tracking us through the jungle, all our preparation felt suddenly inadequate. We'd trained for combat against human enemies, for environmental hazards, for equipment failures and medical emergencies, but nothing in our training, nothing in our experience, had prepared us for the possibility that we might be facing something that combined intelligence, technology, and capabilities that fell outside every tactical manual we'd ever studied. We moved out from our hasty perimeter at 6:12 hours, just as the jungle began its transition from the deep blacks of night to the gray half-light that preceded tropical dawn. The temperature had already climbed to 85 degrees, and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning in warm water. Herrera took point again, his movements through the vegetation nearly silent despite the difficult terrain, and I rotated to rear security, hyper-aware that our mysterious trackers might use our resumption of movement to close the distance. The patrol technique we employed was called traveling overwatch. The point man moved forward while the rest of the team provided security. Then the team advanced to a new position while the point man covered. It was slower than standard movement but provided better security against ambush, critical when we knew hostile forces were operating in the area. What made it particularly challenging in the gap was the vegetation itself. The jungle wasn't just dense, it was actively hostile, with thorns that tore at exposed skin, vines that grabbed ankles, and ground that shifted between solid earth and sucking mud with no warning. Rodriguez, walking ahead of me in the patrol order, had his radio equipment configured for maximum sensitivity, monitoring multiple frequencies simultaneously while recording any electronic emissions for later analysis. Every few minutes he'd key his mic twice, our signal for no change, confirming that the strange interference patterns were continuing. Whatever was pacing us hadn't broken off or fallen behind. If anything, the signals were getting stronger, suggesting our trackers were closing the distance. At 06:47 hours, Herrera's hand shot up in the signal for halt, and the team froze instantly. Through the foliage ahead, I could see him crouched beside something on the ground, his body language radiating tension. Vance moved forward carefully, and I shifted position to maintain our security perimeter, while keeping one eye on whatever had triggered the pause. When Vance examined what Herrera had found, I saw her entire body stiffen. Then she keyed her radio. All elements, move to my position, maintain security. We converged on Vance's location with the practiced efficiency of years working together, each operator taking a position that maintained overlapping fields of fire while allowing us to observe what she'd found. What lay on the jungle floor made my combat-trained mind struggle to process the implications. It was a skeleton, human, mostly complete, with tattered remnants of clothing still clinging to the bones. The uniform was Colombian military, Special Forces insignia still visible on the shredded fabric. But what made this discovery particularly disturbing was the condition of the remains. Wu, our medic and the team member with the most forensic training, knelt beside the skeleton, his examination methodical despite the circumstances. Male, approximately 30 to 40 years old, dead for 6 to 8 months based on decomposition and vegetation growth patterns. But look at this. He indicated the bones with his gloved hand, careful not to disturb potential evidence. These aren't normal breaks. The long bones of the arms and legs have been fractured in multiple places with tremendous force, and several ribs show evidence of massive blunt force trauma. Whatever killed this man didn't just shoot him, it physically tore him apart. Martinez crossed himself, an unconscious gesture that spoke to Catholic upbringing colliding with military pragmatism. Sarge, could this be from the previous recon teams, the ones that went missing? Vance examined the uniform insignia more closely before responding. Negative. This is Colombian SF, not American. But the implications are the same. This man was a trained operator who died violently in the same area we're currently patrolling. She pulled out her camera and photographed the remains from multiple angles, documenting evidence that might help identify the soldier and inform our own tactical decisions. Herrera, who'd been silent since discovering the body, finally spoke, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. I knew men in Colombian Special Forces who disappeared in this area. Good men, professionals. The official report said they were killed by FARC guerrillas, but FARC never operated this deep in the gap. Too dangerous, too far from their supply lines. Now we know what really happened, and it wasn't guerrillas. He stood, scanning the jungle around us with renewed wariness. Captain, we need to establish what we're facing. Is it animal, human, or something else? Because our tactics have to change based on the threat. Vance made a command decision that I respected even as it increased our danger. We continue to objective, but we're now assuming hostile contact is imminent, and that hostile may not conform to standard threat profiles. Wu, take additional tissue samples from the remains, teeth, bone fragments, anything that might help identify him later. Rodriguez, log our coordinates and photograph everything. The rest of you, maintain security and prepare to move in 90 seconds. As Wu worked, I conducted another 360 scan of our perimeter, this time paying special attention to the canopy above us. If something was hunting us with the intelligence and capability suggested by the Colombian operator's death, it might use vertical approaches that standard ground security wouldn't detect. Through my night vision, still valuable despite the growing daylight because of the deep shadows under the canopy, I detected movement approximately 40 meters to our east, something large shifting position in the mid-level vegetation. Contact east, 40 meters, single mover in the canopy, I reported quietly over the radio, keeping my voice conversational to avoid triggering panic. The team's response was immediate and professional, weapons oriented toward the threat, bodies finding whatever cover the terrain offered, fingers moving to triggers while maintaining discipline. The movement stopped as soon as we'd reacted, as if whatever was out there had sensed our awareness and frozen to avoid detection. For 30 seconds, nothing moved except the natural sway of vegetation in the light breeze. Then, impossibly, I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It was vocalization, definitely animal, but also not quite animal, a series of clicks and low-frequency sounds that seemed designed to communicate. What made it particularly disturbing was that the sounds came from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting coordinated behavior among multiple entities. Rodriguez was recording everything, his electronic warfare equipment, capturing audio signatures that would later be analyzed by intelligence specialists who probably wouldn't believe their own data. Talon 2, this is Redline, Rodriguez reported, his voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. I'm now tracking 7 distinct heat signatures in a loose perimeter around our position, range varying from 30 to 60 meters. Movement patterns suggest deliberate positioning to cut off our line of march. Thermal profiles are consistent with large primates, but the coordination and the vocalizations, this isn't normal animal behavior. Vance processed the information with the same calm she'd demonstrated in every crisis I'd seen her face. Wu, finish what you're doing. Everyone else, prepare to break contact to the north. We're not engaging unless they force the issue. On my mark, we move fast and quiet toward the objective, attempting to outpace whatever's tracking us. If they pursue aggressively, we find defensible terrain and establish a perimeter. But I will not authorize firing first. We don't know what we're dealing with, and I won't start a gunfight with unknowns unless they give us no choice. Wu secured his samples in a biohazard bag and nodded his readiness. The team stacked up in file formation, tighter spacing than we'd maintained before, each operator close enough to the next that we could maintain visual contact in the dense vegetation. Vance gave the signal, and we moved north at a fast walk that was just short of running, sacrificing some noise discipline for speed. Gambling that distance would be more valuable than stealth. The jungle seemed to close around us as we moved, the vegetation growing even denser, the ground transitioning from firm earth to treacherous mud that grabbed at our boots. Behind us, I could hear movement paralleling our route, multiple entities keeping pace despite our increased speed. They were herding us, I realized with growing alarm, using our own urgency to drive us in a specific direction. But toward what? An ambush? Terrain that would trap us? Or were we reading tactical intent into what might be simple pursuit behavior? At 0723 hours, we broke through a particularly dense section of undergrowth and found ourselves at the edge of a ravine. The ground dropped away sharply for approximately 20 meters before leveling out at a small stream that cut through the jungle floor. At 0723 hours, we broke through a particularly dense section of undergrowth and found ourselves at the edge of a ravine. The ground dropped away sharply for approximately 20 meters before leveling out at a small stream that cut through the jungle floor. Talon 2, hold position, Vance ordered, and we established a hasty defensive line at the ravine's edge. The sounds of pursuit had stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow more threatening than the noise had been. Rodriguez scanned with his thermals, then reported. Multiple signatures now static, positioned in an arc approximately 20 meters behind us. They've stopped pursuing and appear to be waiting. Talon 2, hold position, Vance ordered, and we established a hasty defensive line at the ravine's edge. The sounds of pursuit had stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow more threatening than the noise had been. Rodriguez scanned with his thermals, then reported. Multiple signatures now static, positioned in an arc approximately 20 meters behind us. They've stopped pursuing and appear to be waiting. Vance studied the ravine, calculating angles and options with the speed that came from years of combat experience. Wu, Martinez, you're crossing first. Fast rope technique. Use that fallen tree as an anchor. Rappel down. Establish security on the far side. Chen, Herrera, you follow. Rodriguez and I will provide overwatch. Then cross last. Martinez moved immediately, pulling rope from his pack and securing it to a massive tree trunk that angled across part of the ravine. The breacher went over the edge first, his descent controlled but rapid, the saw slung across his back bouncing with each movement. Wu followed within seconds, his medical pack secure against his body. Both operators reached the bottom and immediately moved to positions that provided cover and fields of fire back toward our side of the ravine. Herrera went next, moving with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime in challenging terrain. I followed, grabbing the rope and stepping backward over the edge, my M4 held in one hand while my other managed the rope. The descent took perhaps 10 seconds, but in that time, hanging exposed against the ravine wall, I was acutely aware of how vulnerable we were. If something wanted to attack, this was the perfect moment. Half the team separated from the other half, movement restricted, attention focused on not falling. I hit the bottom and immediately moved to a position beside Wu, my weapon oriented back toward the threat we knew was there but couldn't see. Above us, Vance and Rodriguez prepared to descend, but before they could start, the jungle erupted with sound. It wasn't gunfire, it was vocalization, multiple voices producing a chorus of clicks, growls, and sounds that seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. The noise was overwhelming, disorienting, and clearly intended to frighten or confuse us. "Contact!" Herrera shouted, and I saw them, or rather, I saw movement that suggested shapes larger than any human, darker than the shadows, moving through the foliage with impossible speed and coordination. There were at least 4, possibly more, approaching our position from multiple angles. Their movement pattern was sophisticated, using cover, advancing in bounds while others provided overwatch, employing tactics that mirrored our own military training. Above us, Vance made a snap decision. Suppressive fire! Fall back to Chen's position. Establish defensive perimeter. She and Rodriguez opened fire, not aimed shots, but controlled bursts intended to force the approaching entities to seek cover and buy time for the descent. The sound of M4 carbines firing on full automatic was deafening in the ravine, the muzzle flashes bright even in the growing daylight. I saw impacts in the vegetation where Vance was firing, saw branches disintegrate and leaves explode. But I couldn't tell if she was hitting anything solid. Rodriguez descended the rope like it was on fire, his boots barely touching the ravine wall as he slid down in a barely controlled fall. Vance followed immediately, and as soon as her boots hit the ground, she was shouting orders. Displacement south along the stream bed. Move with purpose. Martinez, you've got point. Chen, rear security. Anyone gets a clear shot at a hostile target, you are weapons free, but I want positive identification before you fire. We moved south at a dead run, following the stream that cut through the ravine bottom, our boots splashing through ankle-deep water that soaked through our uniforms but provided the fastest route. Behind us, I could hear movement on both sides of the ravine, our pursuers paralleling our route, matching our speed, occasionally visible as dark shapes moving through the vegetation above us. They were maintaining contact, but not pressing the attack, which suggested either they were being cautious or they were driving us toward something. The ravine continued for approximately 200 meters before opening into a wider valley where the stream spread out into a series of shallow pools. The terrain was more open here, with less canopy coverage, and for the first time since insertion, I could see actual sky above us. Martinez slowed as we entered the valley, his weapon sweeping left and right, looking for threats or opportunities. What he found was neither. It was evidence. Scattered across the valley floor were more remains, bones, equipment, and the unmistakable debris of previous human presence. I counted at least 3 separate sets of remains, all in various stages of decomposition, all showing signs of violent death. Wu moved among them quickly, his medic's training allowing him to assess and catalog even as we maintained movement. Multiple casualties, different time periods, mix of military and civilian gear. Captain, this valley is a killing ground. Vance's tactical assessment was immediate and grim. They've been herding people here for months, maybe years. This is where they hunt. She scanned the valley's perimeter, noting the high ground on 3 sides, the limited exits, the natural funnel that made this location perfect for an ambush. We are not staying here. Martinez, find us an exit to the east, high ground if possible. Rodriguez, get me satellite comms. I need an emergency extraction request sent ASAP. Rodriguez was already working his radio, trying to establish connection with our command post, but his expression told me what I already suspected. No joy on SATCOM, Captain. I'm being jammed across all frequencies. Pattern suggests active electronic warfare, not natural interference. Whatever's tracking us has technology that can block our communications. The implications were staggering. These weren't just animals, weren't just indigenous tribes defending territory. This was sophisticated opposition with capabilities that approached or exceeded our own. A sound from above made us all look up simultaneously. A mistake, because it meant everyone's attention was oriented in the same direction for a critical second. What I saw nearly made me forget my training. Perched on an outcropping approximately 40 meters above us was a figure that looked almost human from a distance. But the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too broad at the shoulders, with limbs that seemed longer than human anatomy allowed. It was watching us with obvious intelligence, its head tracking our movements. And even at this distance, I could see eyes that reflected light like an animal's tapetum lucidum. Contact! High ground! North side! I called out, bringing my M4 to bear, but before I could acquire a proper sight picture, The figure had moved, disappearing behind the outcropping with a speed that seemed physically impossible. Herrera had seen it too, and his reaction confirmed my own disbelief. Madre de Dios. The stories are true. Those are the guardians, the jungle protectors my grandfather told me about. We didn't have time to process the revelation because Martinez had found our exit, a narrow trail that led up the eastern side of the valley, steep but navigable, offering our best chance of escaping the kill zone. "Captain, I've got our route. It's going to be a hard climb, but it gets us out of this valley and back toward our objective." Vance didn't hesitate. "Then we climb. Standard spacing, weapons ready, and if anything follows us up that trail, we establish a choke point and make them pay for every meter." The climb was brutal, the trail more suggestion than reality in many places, requiring us to use hands and feet while somehow maintaining weapon readiness. My lungs burned with the effort, my legs screamed protest, and the weight of my gear felt like it had doubled. But fear is an excellent motivator, and the knowledge that something intelligent and capable was hunting us provided all the encouragement needed to keep moving, despite physical exhaustion. We were halfway up when they attacked. I'd been expecting it, had positioned myself to watch our back trail, but the speed and coordination still caught me off guard. 3 figures emerged from the jungle below, moving up the trail behind us with a grace that made our own climbing look clumsy by comparison. They were definitely humanoid, but built on a scale that suggested strength far beyond human norms, and they were armed, not with guns, but with what looked like crude spears or clubs, weapons that would be devastating at close range. "Contact rear, 3 hostiles, closing fast," I reported, dropping to one knee on the trail to establish a stable firing position. The M4's optics settled on the lead figure, and for a fraction of a second, I had a clear view of what we were facing. It stood perhaps 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair or fur, with a face that was both human and not, prominent brow ridge, wide-set eyes, and a jaw structure that suggested tremendous bite force. Then it ducked behind cover, moving with tactical awareness that suggested it understood firearms and respected their danger. I fired a 3-round burst at where I'd last seen movement, my rounds impacting stone and vegetation, and was rewarded with a howl that was definitely pain rather than challenge. "I've got a hit, target wounded, but still mobile." Above me, Vance and the others had stopped climbing, establishing a defensive position that turned our trail into a kill zone. If our pursuers wanted to reach us, they'd have to come up a narrow path with no cover while we fired down at them from elevated positions, tactically suicidal for any thinking enemy. But they didn't press the attack. Instead, the 3 figures retreated back down the trail, disappearing into the jungle, their withdrawal as coordinated as their approach had been. The sudden absence of threat was almost more unnerving than the attack itself. "Why'd they break off?" Martinez asked, his saw still oriented downslope, ready for renewed contact. Wu provided the most likely answer. "Because they're smart enough to recognize a losing tactical situation. They tested us, found out we're willing and able to fight back effectively, and now they're reassessing." We continued climbing, reaching the top of the trail at 0847 hours, emerging onto relatively level ground that offered better fields of observation and fire. Vance immediately established a defensive perimeter and called a halt to assess our situation. "Equipment check, ammunition count, status report. I need to know what we've got left to work with." The reports came back quickly. All personnel present and functional, no injuries beyond minor cuts and exhaustion, ammunition expenditure minimal. Vance and I had fired perhaps 60 rounds combined during our contact. But Rodriguez's communications report was concerning. "Captain, I've now completely lost contact with our command post. No satellite connection, no HF radio, no emergency frequencies. We're effectively isolated with no ability to request extraction or report our situation." Vance processed this with visible frustration. "Then we continue mission. The objective is still 1 click northeast. We still need intelligence on the cartel facility, and now we've got additional intelligence on whatever the hell is operating in this area. We gather what we came for, then we make our own way to the primary extraction point at 1800 hours. Herrera had been silent during our climbing and subsequent security halt, But now he spoke with the authority of someone who'd reached a decision. "Captain, those creatures, the Guardians, they're territorial. They've been driving us away from their core area, and this valley was meant to kill us or convince us to leave. But our objective is north, which means we're moving parallel to their territory rather than deeper into it. If we're careful, if we don't provoke them further, they might let us pass." It was hope, rather than certainty. But in our current situation, hope was a tactical asset worth considering. Vance nodded slowly. "Then we move carefully and we don't engage unless they force us to. Our mission is reconnaissance, not combat. And I'm not interested in starting a war with an enemy we don't understand and can't call for support against. Everyone clear?" The affirmatives came back, and we prepared to move toward our objective, now carrying the knowledge that we were operating in an environment where humanity wasn't the apex predator and where intelligence and technology existed in forms we'd never been trained to encounter. We moved northeast through terrain that gradually transitioned from dense jungle to slightly more open forest, following a route that Herrera insisted would keep us at the edge of what he called the Guardians' core territory. The morning heat had intensified to the point where sweat soaked through our uniforms within minutes, and the humidity made every breath a conscious effort. But the oppressive environment was secondary to the constant awareness that we were being observed, tracked, and assessed by something that had already demonstrated its capability to kill trained operators. At 09:34 hours, we detected the first signs of the cartel facility. A faint smell of chemical processing carried on the wind, barely perceptible but unmistakable once identified. Cocaine production creates distinctive odors from the chemicals used to process coca leaves into powder, ether, acetone, ammonia, and other substances that don't occur naturally in jungle environments. Wu confirmed it with his chemical detection equipment, a handheld sensor that analyzed air composition for common drug manufacturing compounds. I'm getting positive readings for multiple VOCs consistent with cocaine processing, bearing 045 degrees, estimated distance less than 1,000 meters. Vance called a halt and pulled out her tablet, overlaying our GPS position onto the satellite imagery we'd studied during mission planning. "We're approaching from the southwest, which should give us the best vantage point for observation. The facility is in a small valley with a stream running through it. They're using the water for processing. Our observation post will be on this ridge, approximately 300 meters from the main structures, elevation advantage of about 50 meters. She looked at each of us in turn. "Remember, this is reconnaissance only. We observe, we document, we identify targets, and we leave. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We've already had more excitement than this mission called for." Martinez raised a tactical concern. "Captain, what if the Guardians and the cartel aren't separate problems? What if they're coordinated somehow? It would explain why this facility has operated successfully in an area where other operations failed. Maybe the cartel has some kind of arrangement with whatever's out there." It was a disturbing possibility that I hadn't considered, but it made a certain tactical sense. If the cartel had somehow negotiated or coerced cooperation from the entities controlling this territory, they'd have perfect security against military or law enforcement operations. Herrera shook his head firmly. "No, that doesn't fit with what my people believe about the Guardians. They're protectors of the jungle, defenders against exploitation. They wouldn't ally with drug processors who poison the environment with their chemicals. More likely, the cartel is operating here despite the Guardians, not because of them, gambling that their security measures and their willingness to defend the facility with force are enough to deter attack." He paused, considering implications. "Which means we might not be the only ones being hunted. The cartel could be under pressure too." We continued our approach, moving with extreme caution now that we were entering the cartel's likely security perimeter. Standard practice for drug facilities in remote areas was to establish sensor networks, motion detectors, cameras, even simple tripwires connected to alarms, creating a defensive buffer that would alert security forces to any intrusion. But as we moved closer, I noticed something odd. There were sensors. I could see them mounted on trees and camouflaged posts, but many appeared damaged or destroyed, torn from their mountings with what looked like significant force. Rodriguez photographed the damaged equipment with his helmet-mounted camera, preserving evidence for later analysis. Captain, someone or something has been systematically taking down the cartel's security infrastructure. This sensor was ripped out of its mounting maybe 48 hours ago, and it's not the only one. I'm seeing similar damage patterns on multiple devices. Vance examined the equipment herself before rendering judgment. This wasn't done by humans. The force required to tear these sensors free would require tools or equipment that would leave different damage patterns. Whatever did this used raw strength. At 10:47 hours, we reached our planned observation post, a rocky outcropping on the ridge overlooking the valley where the cartel facility operated. The location provided excellent concealment among boulders and vegetation, while offering clear lines of sight to the structures below. We established our hide site with the care and attention to detail that special operations teams had perfected over decades, camouflage netting to break up our silhouette, fields of fire that covered likely approach routes, and individual positions that allowed each operator to observe different sections of the target area while remaining protected from detection. The facility itself was more extensive than our intelligence had suggested. The satellite imagery had identified 3 main structures, but from our elevated position, I could count at least 6 buildings, plus several large tents that probably served as storage or additional processing space. There were approximately 20 personnel visible, most wearing civilian clothing but carrying weapons, AK-47s primarily, with a few AR-15-style rifles. 2 pickup trucks were parked near the largest building, and I could see what looked like a generator shed that provided electrical power. At what was most significant, what made the entire facility's situation immediately clear, was the evidence of defense preparation. The cartel hadn't just built a drug processing operation, they'd fortified it. There were fighting positions around the perimeter, sandbags stacked to create cover, and what looked like crew-served weapons positioned to cover the approaches. This wasn't standard security for a remote facility. This was a garrison expecting attack and prepared to defend against significant force. Wu, observing through his spotting scope, provided detailed analysis. I'm seeing fighting positions oriented primarily toward the jungle approaches, not toward the access trail they'd use for resupply. The defensive posture suggests they're more worried about threats from the environment than from law enforcement. Also, check out the personnel behavior. They're nervous, jumpy, constantly scanning the perimeter, even though it's broad daylight. He adjusted his scope's focus. 3rd building from the left, there's someone who looks like command. Older male, better equipment, others defer to him. That's probably our high-value target. Vance began methodically documenting everything, using her camera to capture imagery that would later be analyzed by intelligence specialists. She photographed the buildings, the personnel, the defensive positions, the vehicles, and anything else that might provide actionable intelligence. Rodriguez was recording radio transmissions, his equipment capturing the cartel's communications traffic for later analysis. Martinez maintained security, his attention focused on our perimeter rather than the target, making sure we weren't surprised by threats we weren't watching for. I was pulling rear security, watching the jungle behind our position, when I noticed movement approximately 100 meters to our south. Through my optic, I could make out a figure moving through the vegetation, tall, dark, and definitely not human. It was one of the Guardians, and it was moving parallel to the ridgeline, heading toward a position that would give it direct observation of the cartel facility. The realization hit me with the force of revelation. We weren't the only ones conducting surveillance on this target. Captain, I've got visual on one of the Guardians, 100 meters south, moving toward an observation position similar to ours, I reported quietly over our internal comms. Vance immediately shifted to observe, her own optic tracking the figure I'd indicated. For perhaps 30 seconds, we watched it move with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, navigating terrain that would challenge trained operators with ease that suggested intimate familiarity with this environment. Then it stopped, settled into a position among rocks and vegetation, and began what was clearly surveillance of the cartel facility below. Herrera, who'd moved to observe alongside Vance, spoke with a mixture of vindication and concern. They're preparing to attack. That's reconnaissance before assault. The Guardians have been probing the facility's defenses, destroying their sensors, and now they're gathering intelligence before the main attack. This isn't random violence or territorial defense. This is coordinated military action. The implications were profound. We weren't just dealing with intelligent creatures defending their territory. We were observing sophisticated tactical planning that suggested these entities had organizational structures and strategic thinking that rivaled human military capabilities. Below us in the valley, the cartel's security forces had noticed something. I watched through my optic as several men moved to elevated positions, their weapons ready, scanning the perimeter with obvious tension. One man, the older individual Wu had identified as likely command, was shouting orders that I couldn't hear from our distance, but could see in his body language and the rapid response of his subordinates. They knew something was wrong, could feel the threat even if they couldn't see it, and their defensive posture shifted from routine vigilance to combat readiness. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of combat that every operator recognizes, the moment when circumstances collide and violence becomes unavoidable regardless of plans or intentions. From the jungle to the west of the facility, at least 6 figures emerged, moving with coordinated purpose toward the cartel's perimeter. They were Guardians, similar to the one we'd encountered earlier, tall and powerful, carrying crude weapons but moving with tactical awareness that spoke to training or instinct, honed through countless engagements. The cartel's security forces opened fire immediately, AK-47s and rifles creating a sustained fusillade that echoed through the valley. I watched impacts in the vegetation where the Guardians had been, saw trees shredded by automatic fire, saw dirt kicked up by rounds that impacted earth rather than flesh. But the Guardians didn't retreat. They advanced, using cover and concealment, bounding forward in small groups while others provided support, employing infantry tactics that any military instructor would recognize as fundamentally sound. "Talon 2, we are not engaging," Vance ordered firmly over our comms. "This is not our fight. We observe, we document, and we do not compromise our position by joining someone else's battle. Everyone stay down, stay quiet, and let this play out." It was the correct tactical decision, the only decision that aligned with our mission parameters. But watching combat unfold without intervening felt wrong, at a visceral level that training couldn't entirely overcome. The first Guardian reached the cartel's perimeter, and what followed was carnage that my training struggled to categorize. The creature moved through the defensive position with a speed and strength that seemed physically impossible, dispatching cartel guards with brutal efficiency. A club-like weapon, carved from wood or stone but wielded with tremendous force, connected with one guard, and even from 300 meters away, I could see the devastating impact. The man went down and didn't get up. More Guardians breached the perimeter, and the cartel's organized defense collapsed into desperate individual fights for survival. Some guards tried to retreat toward the buildings, others held their ground and fired until their weapons ran dry or they were overwhelmed. The sound of gunfire was constant, punctuated by sounds that might have been humans screaming or might have been the Guardians' vocalizations. At this distance and volume, they blended into a chaotic symphony of violence. Wu was recording everything, his camera capturing footage that would either revolutionize biology and anthropology or be classified so deeply that no civilian would ever know these events had occurred. "Captain, are you seeing this? They're using fire and maneuver tactics. They're communicating through vocalizations and hand signals. And they're deliberately targeting command and control infrastructure. This isn't animal behavior. This is warfare conducted by a non-human intelligence." One of the cartel's pickup trucks attempted to escape, its engine roaring as it accelerated toward the access trail that led out of the valley. 2 Guardians intercepted it with coordinated action, one threw a large rock that shattered the windshield while the other positioned itself directly in the vehicle's path. The truck swerved, trying to avoid collision, and overturned, rolling multiple times before coming to rest against a tree. The Guardians approached the wreckage with weapons ready, and I had to look away from what happened next. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 8 minutes from first contact to final cessation of resistance. When it ended, the cartel facility was silent except for small fires burning in several structures and the wind moving through broken vegetation. The Guardians moved through the complex, methodical and thorough, checking bodies and systematically destroying equipment. They weren't looting. They were eliminating the cartel's capability to resume operations, rendering the facility permanently non-functional. Then, in a display that suggested awareness we hadn't fully credited, one of the Guardians, larger than the others, possibly a leader, turned and looked directly at our observation post. The distance was significant, our camouflage was professional grade, and we'd maintained absolute silence, but somehow it knew exactly where we were. For a long moment that felt eternal, human and non-human intelligence regarded each other across 300 meters of jungle valley, each assessing the threat posed by the other. Herrera whispered, barely audible even to those right beside him. "Don't move. Don't make any aggressive gestures. It's deciding whether we're a threat or just observers." The Guardian continued its stare for another few seconds, then turned away, issuing a series of vocalizations that brought the other Guardians to attention. As a group, they began moving toward the jungle, carrying several bodies. Their own dead or wounded, I realized, showing a level of care for casualties that spoke to social bonds and cultural values. Within minutes, the Guardians had disappeared back into the jungle, leaving behind a facility that looked like a war zone. Vance immediately began consolidating our intelligence. "We've got imagery, audio, and visual confirmation of everything that just happened." Within minutes, the Guardians had disappeared back into the jungle, leaving behind a facility that looked like a war zone. Vance immediately began consolidating our intelligence. "We've got imagery, audio, and visual confirmation of everything that just happened. Mission parameters have changed. Our original objective is now destroyed, but the intelligence we've gathered is potentially more valuable than anything we'd have gotten from normal surveillance. We need to extract and report immediately." Rodriguez was already working his communications equipment, cycling through frequencies and protocols, trying to establish any kind of connection with our command post. "Still getting jammed, Captain. Whatever was blocking us hasn't let up. We're going to have to physically move to the extraction point and hope the interference is localized to this area." Vance considered our options, weighing risks against requirements, then made her decision. "We moved to primary extraction LZ immediately. Full tactical movement, weapons ready, and we assume the Guardians are still monitoring us. If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead. But that doesn't mean they'll tolerate us staying in their territory." We began breaking down our observation post, carefully packing equipment, policing our area to leave no trace of our presence. It was standard practice, the kind of attention to detail that separated professional operators from amateurs, but it felt inadequate given what we'd witnessed. How did you properly sanitize a position after observing one intelligent species wage war against another? What procedures covered documenting evidence of beings that science insisted didn't exist? As we prepared to move out, Martinez posed the question that none of us wanted to voice. "Captain, what happens when we report this? Who's going to believe that we watched 7-foot-tall humanoid creatures with Stone Age weapons systematically destroy a fortified cartel position using modern military tactics? And more importantly, what's going to happen to those creatures when the military-industrial complex decides they're either a threat that needs to be eliminated or a resource that needs to be exploited?" Vance's expression was grim, reflecting thoughts that had probably been running through her mind since we'd first encountered evidence of the Guardians. "That's above our pay grade, Martinez. Our job is to gather intelligence and report it up the chain of command. What gets done with that intelligence, how it gets classified, and what actions get authorized, those decisions get made by people with a lot more stars on their collars than we'll ever have. Right now, our priority is getting out of this jungle alive and intact. We'll worry about the larger implications once we're back on friendly territory." We moved out at 11:34 hours, heading west toward our primary extraction point, approximately 4 clicks distant. The route would take us through territory we'd already traversed, retracing part of our insertion patrol but from a different angle. It should have felt safer, moving through terrain we'd already scouted. But the knowledge of what existed in this jungle made every shadow suspect, every sound a potential threat warning. The jungle seemed different now, transformed by knowledge from merely hostile terrain into a landscape populated by intelligence that understood tactics, strategy, and warfare. Every 100 meters of movement required constant vigilance, not just for physical threats, but for signs that we were being observed, followed, or herded towards circumstances not of our choosing. The temperature had climbed above 90 degrees, humidity approaching saturation levels, and my uniform was soaked through with sweat that had nowhere to evaporate in the still air beneath the canopy. At 12:47 hours, we discovered the first sign that our extraction might not proceed as planned. Rodriguez, monitoring our communications equipment, detected radio traffic on frequencies that shouldn't have been active, Spanish language transmissions using encryption protocols that suggested military or professional security forces rather than cartel street soldiers. He recorded samples and attempted triangulation, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he worked. "Captain, I'm picking up organized radio nets, multiple call signs, tactical traffic patterns. Someone's mobilizing a significant force, and based on direction-finding analysis, they're positioned between us and our primary extraction LZ." Vance called a halt and gathered the team for quick leadership consultation. In special operations, decision-making was often collaborative when time permitted, drawing on the experience and expertise of the entire team rather than relying solely on rank hierarchy. Options. Do we continue to primary LZ and risk contact with unknown forces? Do we divert to secondary LZ, which adds 6 clicks to our movement? Or do we find a hide site and wait for darkness before attempting extraction? She looked at each of us, inviting input. Herrera provided local context. "If those radio transmissions are who I think they are, Cartel Quick Reaction Force from their main base camp south of here, they're responding to what happened at the processing facility. They'll be moving in strength, probably 40 to 50 personnel with vehicles if the terrain allows. They'll be angry, scared, and looking for something to shoot. If we try to push through them to reach the extraction point, we'll end up in a firefight we can't win." His assessment was tactically sound, but strategically problematic. Every alternative carried significant risk. Wu raised a medical concern. "Captain, we need to consider hydration and exhaustion. We've been operating in extreme heat for over 12 hours with minimal water resupply. If we add another 6 clicks of hard movement to reach the secondary LZ, we're risking heat casualties even without enemy contact." It was a valid point. Special operations training pushed human endurance to extreme limits, but there were absolute physiological boundaries that training couldn't overcome. Dehydration and heat exhaustion killed as surely as bullets, just more slowly. I offered tactical analysis based on our current situation. We're compromised from multiple directions. The Guardians know we're here and are probably tracking us. The cartel is mobilizing forces in response to the attack on their facility, and we've got no communications with friendly forces to request support or alternative extraction. I recommend we move to high ground, establish a defensive position, and attempt to restore communications. If we can get word out about our situation, Command can authorize alternative extraction methods, maybe a combat rescue team or cross-border insertion into Colombia. Vance weighed the options with visible concentration, her tactical mind processing variables and probabilities. We moved to high ground. There's a ridgeline 1 click northeast that should give us elevation advantage, better fields of fire, and possibly line of sight for communications. We establish a perimeter, Rodriguez works his magic getting comms back online, and we prepare for the possibility that we're going to have to defend our position until extraction assets can reach us. It's not ideal, but it's better than wandering through the jungle hoping we don't run into either the Guardians or cartel forces while we're in column formation. The decision made, we adjusted our route and began moving toward the ridgeline Vance had identified. Martinez took point, his saw providing heavy firepower if we encountered resistance. I rotated to middle of the formation, and Herrera pulled rear security, his intimate knowledge of the terrain and the threats it contained making him ideal for watching our back trail. Movement was slower now, each step deliberate, every potential ambush site carefully cleared before we committed the team to moving through it. At 13:34 hours we heard it, the sound of helicopters approaching from the south. The distinctive thump of rotor blades carried through the humid air, growing louder as multiple aircraft moved toward our position. Rodriguez identified them through sound signature analysis. Hueys, probably UH-1H models, 2 or 3 birds based on rotor acoustics. That's cartel for sure. They've been using Vietnam-era helicopters purchased from surplus markets for years. The implications were serious. Helicopters meant mobility, meant the cartel could insert personnel rapidly anywhere in the operational area, meant our advantage of stealth and concealment was compromised by their ability to search from above. We found concealment under thick canopy and waited while the helicopters passed overhead, their search pattern systematic and thorough. Through gaps in the vegetation, I could see one helicopter clearly, a weathered UH-1H in civilian colors, door gunners visible on both sides armed with what looked like M60 machine guns. The aircraft was flying low, maybe 200 feet above the canopy, slow enough that observers could spot movement on the ground. We remained absolutely still, counting on camouflage and canopy coverage to hide us from aerial observation. The helicopters completed their pass and continued north, presumably toward the destroyed processing facility. Once their sound had faded to distant background noise, Vance ordered us back into movement. They'll find the facility, they'll see what happened, and then they're going to flood this area with personnel, looking for whoever's responsible. The Guardians have already proven they can handle cartel security forces on the ground, but those helicopters add a dimension that might change the tactical picture. We need to reach that ridgeline and establish comms before this entire area becomes a combat zone. The terrain grew steeper as we approached the ridgeline, the jungle transitioning to rocky ground with less vegetation but better observation. It was slower going, requiring hand-over-hand climbing in several places, but the elevation gain was worth the effort. At 1425 hours, we reached a position that Vance assessed as defensible, a rocky outcropping that provided natural cover, elevation advantage over the surrounding terrain, and multiple escape routes if we needed to break contact and evade. We established a defensive perimeter with overlapping fields of fire, each operator positioned to cover a different approach vector, while remaining protected behind rock formations that would stop small arms fire. Martinez positioned his saw to cover the most likely avenue of approach from below, his 200-round ammunition drum providing sustained firepower if we were attacked. Wu set up a casualty collection point in the center of our perimeter, prepping medical supplies for immediate use. Herrera and I took positions covering our flanks, while Vance coordinated overall defense and Rodriguez worked frantically to restore communications. Rodriguez cycled through every frequency, every protocol, every backup system we'd brought with us. His portable satellite antenna was deployed and oriented toward the correct orbital position. His encryption modules were functioning, and his equipment diagnostics showed green across the board. But still nothing, no signal, no connection, just electronic silence that suggested jamming so comprehensive it bordered on impossible given our equipment's capabilities.
Captain, I can't explain this. My equipment is functional. We've got line of sight to satellites, but it's like there's a bubble around this entire area that's blocking all RF transmission. This level of electronic warfare capability shouldn't exist outside of major military powers, and definitely shouldn't be available to cartel organizations.
Wu posed the question that I'd been avoiding thinking about. What if it's not the cartel jamming us? What if it's the Guardians? We've already established they've got some level of technology. They disabled the cartel's security sensors. They seem to understand firearms and tactics. And they've been operating in this area for who knows how long without being documented or studied. Maybe they've developed or acquired electronic warfare capabilities too. It was a disturbing possibility that expanded the Guardians from dangerous territorial predators into something far more sophisticated and potentially threatening. The sound of gunfire in the distance interrupted our speculation. Automatic weapons fire, sustained and heavy, coming from the direction of the processing facility we'd observed earlier. The cartel's quick reaction force had arrived and encountered something that required significant expenditure of ammunition. Vance pulled out binoculars and scanned toward the sound, though the jungle canopy blocked direct observation at this distance. That's a sustained firefight, multiple weapons systems. Sounds like they're in heavy contact. Either they're shooting at Guardians or they're shooting at shadows. But either way, they're burning through ammunition fast.
Martinez listened to the distant combat with the practiced ear of someone who'd spent years in firefights. That's panic fire, Captain. Undisciplined, high volume, not controlled bursts. They're scared and they're shooting at anything that moves.
which means they've either seen the Guardians or they've found evidence of what the Guardians did to the facility security force. He checked his Solo's ammunition drum, ensuring feed was smooth and the weapon was ready for immediate use. If they push in our direction, if they're running from something, we're sitting right in their path. The gunfire continued for another 10 minutes, then ceased abruptly. Not a gradual tapering off as contact was broken, but a sudden stop that suggested either total victory or total defeat. The silence that followed was somehow more ominous than the sound of combat had been. Herrera crossed himself again, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as his response to stress and uncertainty. The Guardians have engaged them. That's the only explanation for why experienced cartel soldiers would stop firing so suddenly. They're either dead or they've retreated in disorder. Vance made a tactical assessment that aligned with my own thinking. If the cartel forces have been mauled by the Guardians, we're dealing with a completely changed operational environment. The Guardians will be mobile, aggressive, and they've now proven they can defeat superior numbers with superior firepower. We need communications restored and we need extraction, but we also need to consider that our original threat assessment was inadequate. We're not just dealing with territorial animals. We're facing an organized force with capabilities we don't fully understand and can't currently counter. Rodriguez was still working his equipment, but his attention was divided between the communications gear and the jungle around us. Captain, I'm picking up electronic emissions again. Same pattern we detected when we first realized we were being tracked. Multiple sources closing on our position from different vectors, range decreasing. They're surrounding us, and whatever's generating these signals is moving with coordination that suggests communication between units. He looked up from his equipment, his expression reflecting the concern we all felt. We're being hunted, and they're using technology to do it. At 15-18 hours, I saw the first definitive proof that we were under observation. Movement on the ridgeline approximately 300 meters to our east, a figure that was unmistakably one of the Guardians, standing partially concealed by vegetation but clearly watching our position. I reported it immediately. Contact east, 300 meters, single Guardian, observing our position, but not approaching. Vance shifted to confirm my sighting, and within seconds she'd identified two more. Additional contacts, one north at 400 meters, one south at approximately the same distance. They've got us bracketed. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. We were surrounded by entities we couldn't communicate with, couldn't predict, and had already proven capable of defeating superior forces in direct combat. Our communications were blocked, our extraction was compromised, and our ammunition, while adequate for a normal firefight, might not be sufficient if we had to fight our way through multiple Guardian positions to reach safety. Every operator knows there are moments in combat when the situation transitions from challenging to potentially catastrophic, and I could feel that transition happening in real time. Then, unexpectedly, one of the Guardians did something that changed everything. The one positioned to our east began moving toward our position, not aggressively but deliberately, its body language suggesting approach rather than attack. It carried no visible weapons, its hands were empty and visible, and its pace was measured, approximately the speed of a casual walk. 50 meters from our perimeter, it stopped, raised both hands in a gesture that was unmistakably peaceful across virtually every human culture, and made a series of vocalizations that sounded almost like speech. Herrera responded before anyone could stop him, standing slowly from his position and raising his own hands in mirror of the Guardian's gesture. "No somos enemigos," he called out in Spanish. "We are not enemies." Then repeated in English and in what I assumed was an indigenous language. The Guardian tilted its head, a gesture so human it was startling, then responded with another series of vocalizations. The sounds were complex, modulated, and carried what seemed like intentional meaning, even though I couldn't understand any of it. "Herrera, what the hell are you doing?" Vance hissed, her weapon still oriented toward the Guardian, but her finger off the trigger, recognizing that Herrera might be attempting communication that could save all our lives. Herrera didn't turn around, keeping his attention focused on the Guardian. "Establishing contact, Captain. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead. But they haven't attacked. They've been watching, tracking. and now one is approaching under what looks like a flag of truce. My grandfather told me the Guardians could understand human speech even if they couldn't speak it themselves. I'm testing that theory. The Guardian made another vocalization, then pointed deliberately toward the north, the direction where the cartel forces had been operating. It made slashing gestures that were clearly meant to communicate violence or danger, then pointed at us and shook its head in a gesture that was universally recognizable as negation. The meaning seemed clear. The cartel was the enemy, not us. Then it did something even more remarkable. It pointed at itself and the other visible Guardians, made a gesture that encompassed the entire jungle around us, and then pointed firmly downward, a claim of territory and ownership. Wu, watching this exchange with the fascinated attention of someone witnessing something unprecedented, spoke quietly. It's establishing parameters. This is their territory. The cartel is their enemy, and we're being given a choice. Leave peacefully or be treated as hostile. That's sophisticated communication and even more sophisticated diplomacy. We're not dealing with animals, Captain. We're dealing with people, just not human people. Vance made a decision that took courage because it meant trusting beings we didn't understand in a situation where trust could be fatal. She slowly stood, weapon lowered but still held, hands visible, and addressed the Guardian directly. We understand. This is your territory. We came to observe the people who were harming it. She gestured toward where the processing facility had been. Not to harm it ourselves. We want to leave peacefully. We need to reach this location. She pulled out her GPS and showed the coordinates of our extraction point, hoping the Guardian would understand the device and the concept. And then we'll be gone. The Guardian studied the GPS device with obvious interest, leaning forward slightly to examine it, then looked back at Vance. It made a series of gestures, pointing to the GPS, then sweeping its arm in an arc that suggested movement, then pointing emphatically westward. After a moment's thought, it made a different gesture, pointing to itself, then to us, then westward again. The implication seemed clear. It was offering to guide us, or at least indicating that westward was the safe direction to travel. Martinez voiced the concern we all felt. Captain, we don't know if we can trust this. It could be leading us into an ambush, herding us into a kill zone. We'd be following a potential hostile through terrain it knows perfectly while we're essentially blind. It was valid tactical analysis, the kind of skepticism that kept operators alive. But Vance had clearly made her assessment of the situation and the risks involved. We're already in a kill zone, Martinez. We're surrounded, our comms are down, and we've got cartel forces somewhere in this jungle who are going to be looking for anyone to blame for what happened to their facility. This Guardian is offering us something, safe passage, guidance, maybe even protection. I'm inclined to accept that offer, because right now it's the best option we've got. She looked at each of us, ensuring everyone understood the decision and its implications. We're going to follow its lead, but we maintain tactical formation, weapons ready, and if this turns into an ambush, we fight our way out. Clear? The affirmatives came back, some more reluctant than others, and we prepared to move. The Guardian watched our preparations with what seemed like patience, waiting until we were ready, before beginning to move westward along the ridgeline. It set a pace that was sustainable for humans carrying heavy loads, checking periodically to ensure we were following, and its route selection was masterful, choosing paths that provided good footing, adequate cover, and avoided the densest vegetation. As we moved, I noticed other Guardians paralleling our route, maintaining distance but clearly present. They were providing security, I realized, not just guiding us out of their territory, but actively protecting us during the transit. It was an act of surprising sophistication and, dare I think it, kindness. These beings had every reason to see us as threats or intruders, but they'd chosen instead to facilitate our departure, rather than eliminate us. At 16:42 hours, we heard helicopters again, closer this time, and the Guardian leading us immediately gestured for us to take cover. We moved into concealment under thick canopy, and the Guardian did something remarkable. It produced what looked like a carved stone object, approximately the size of a large cell phone, and manipulated it in a way that suggested activating some kind of device. Within seconds, I felt a strange tingling sensation, and Rodriguez's electronic equipment began showing massive interference across all frequencies. "Captain, that thing just activated some kind of jamming device," Rodriguez reported, his voice carrying both excitement and disbelief. "It's generating massive electromagnetic interference. That's what's been blocking our communications since insertion. They have technology, actual functional technology, and they're using it deliberately to create electronic dead zones." The revelation was staggering. These beings weren't just physically capable, they possessed technological capabilities that suggested either independent development or acquisition from human sources. The helicopters passed overhead, their crews clearly searching for something but unable to locate us through the combination of canopy coverage and whatever electronic countermeasures the Guardian had activated. Once the aircraft had moved away, the Guardian deactivated its device, and the tingling sensation faded. It looked at us with what I could only interpret as satisfaction, as if to say, "See, we can protect you from your human enemies." We continued moving, and the Guardian led us through terrain that gradually descended from the ridgeline toward lower elevation. The route was circuitous, avoiding areas where we might encounter cartel forces or difficult terrain, and I began to understand that this being had intimate knowledge not just of geography but of human movements and threats in this region. It had been watching the cartel for a long time, learning their patterns, understanding their capabilities, and preparing for the eventual confrontation that we'd witnessed. At 17:34 hours, the Guardian brought us to a halt at the edge of a clearing that I recognized from our mission planning materials. It was our primary extraction LZ, the location where our helicopter was scheduled to pick us up in less than 30 minutes. The Guardian pointed to the clearing, then to the sky, making a gesture that suggested aircraft. It had not only guided us to our extraction point but had understood from our earlier GPS display exactly where we needed to go. Herrera stepped forward and addressed the Guardian directly. "Thank you. Gracias. We understand now. You protect this place from those who would harm it. We're not your enemies. We'll tell our people about you, about what you've done here." The Guardian regarded him for a long moment, then made a gesture that could have been acknowledgement or could have been warning. Then it pointed at each of us in turn, tapped the side of its head in a gesture that clearly meant "remember," and pointed back toward the jungle interior. The message was unambiguous. Remember what you've seen, remember whose territory this is, and don't come back. The Guardian melted back into the jungle with the other members of its group, disappearing so completely it was as if they'd never existed. We were alone in the clearing, with our extraction time approaching and more questions than answers about what we'd encountered. The response was immediate and carried audible relief. "Talon 2, Guardian base reads you Lima Charlie. Extraction bird is inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Confirm all personnel present and ready for pickup. Over." Rodriguez confirmed, and we established our extraction security perimeter, weapons oriented outward, watching for any threats that might interfere with our departure. The next 12 minutes felt eternal, each second carrying the possibility that something might go wrong at the last moment. At 18:03 hours, we heard the beautiful sound of American helicopter rotors approaching from the south. The MH-60 came in fast and low, flaring into our LZ with the kind of aggressive flying that suggested the crew had been briefed on potential hostile forces in the area. We loaded with practiced efficiency, and within 30 seconds of touchdown, we were airborne and heading south toward Panama City and safety. As the helicopter gained altitude and the Darien Gap fell away beneath us, I looked back at the endless green carpet of jungle and wondered what other secrets it held, what other intelligences called it home, and whether humanity was ready for the knowledge that we weren't alone on this planet in terms of creatures capable of thought, technology, and warfare. The mission had been a success in terms of gathering intelligence, but the intelligence we'd gathered would challenge everything we thought we knew about biology, evolution, and our place in the world's hierarchy of sentient beings.